Me just say your complete name and unit that you served with.
John Samuel Kerr, Company C, 119th Armored Engineer Battalion, 12th Armored Division.
This interview is being done by Dr. Vernon L. Williams, Department of History at Abilene Christian University. Sam, if you would, let's start with growing up, your parents. Can you tell me who they were, give me their names and where you grew up?
I grew up in a small town in Upper Michigan, Ironwood, Michigan. My father was a fireman on the Chicago Northwestern Railway. My mother, of course, was a mother and homekeeper. Went to a Catholic school to my graduation in '38. I had no further education, and I had to move to Lower Michigan, the Ann Arbor area, to get a job. My father couldn't work anymore, and actually what I was doing was supporting my mother and father and 5 brothers and a sister.
Tell me about your brothers and sisters. Who were they and what happened to them? What did they do in life?
My older brother taught school in Romeo, Michigan.
What was his name?
Merlin James Kerr. He had gone originally to a seminary to become a priest. And when the war broke out, he was scheduled to go to Rome for his last 2 years. And they canceled that trip because of the war, and he dropped out of the priesthood. He went to work in a defense plant, King Sealy Corporation, in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And he worked there until he took the job as teaching in Romeo, Michigan. Just go right on down the line. The next younger brother was in the Air Force during World War II, and he married a Japanese girl and came back and lived in Romeo with my older brother.
What was his name?
Eugene J. Kerr. The next younger brother was Bob, Robert J. Kerr. He's lived in Akron, Ohio, and had a business, air conditioning and heating business, which he has just recently turned over to his children. Eugene was in the Air Force during the war, but he worked in a top secret job at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, where they were doing something had to do with atomic bombs or fuses for the atomic bombs. He quit about 15 years ago and just took over a job as a Well, he worked for the Air Force anyway as an instructor. He has since retired from there and lives at home. He married a girl from Biloxi. That's where he was living, and they had 3 children. And then my next family member was Mary Teresa Kerr. She got married and lived in Pensacola, Florida, brought up a family. Her husband worked for some company that made insulation. And
You had a younger brother then? Younger than Mary?
David, that's what I was trying to think of. Dave went to college in Michigan and went, not Southwestern, Michigan State College. And when he got out, through college, he got married to a local woman, and for a while he went up to Romeo, where my older brother was, and became a teaching job up there. So both of them retired from teaching. And I guess that's the limit of that.
If we go back to the days when you were growing up in your home with your mother and your father, first of all, if I were to ask you to describe what kind of person your father was, what would you say? How would you describe him?
Tops as a father. And my mother was she was the guiding light to the whole family, though. My father worked on the railroad, was injured in an accident. That's why he couldn't work anymore. But I couldn't ask for a better father.
What about your home? If we could go back in a time machine, walk in the front door and just stand there looking in, what kind of home did you have? Could you describe what we would see? Where did the boys sleep and how was it arranged?
Okay, if we were to go in the front door, probably the first thing you'd see is a pot-bellied stove a little bit to your left, but in the middle of the room. The next object you'd see would be a buffet with a kind of a mirror at the back and a shelf where my mother kept all of her dishes and silver, candles and things like that. But immediately to your left would be a stairway going upstairs. On the other side of the pot-bellied stove would be a doorway, no door, just a curtain. And my mother and father slept in there, in a bedroom. On your right would be old rocking chair. He's still standing in the doorway. The old rocking chair was for my grandfather. He didn't stay with us very long before he died. Then in the middle of the room on the right was a radio. It was in a cabinet, but the radio wasn't much good. And beyond that, you came to a doorway into the kitchen. Had a coal or wood-burning stove, which my mother did all the cooking on. And to the left was the table. To the back right-hand corner was a closet where it was kind of deep like a fruit closet. She kept all her dishes, canned goods, potatoes, onions, things like that in there. And between that room and the front and the side door, which came into the kitchen, was a sink, kitchen sink. We washed all our own dishes, of course, the boys, and we fought about it, who was going to wash and who was going to wipe. Then to the left of the stove, which is at the far end of the room, was a doorway going into a bathroom, which was quite large, really, but it had a bathtub on the right-hand side, and then a little alcove, and the toilet was there. If you went straight through without going right or left, you'd come into a big woodshed, which had wood in it, and that's it. And when you came back into the living room, then the first room we came to the left was a stairway going upstairs. There were 2 rooms up there. And between those 2 rooms and the one my mother and father slept in, at times there were 7 of us in those 2 rooms.
What else do you remember about the neighborhood where you lived? What was around this house, other neighbors, and how close were you?
Well, we were fairly close. There were small lots. The guy next on my right was a plumber. He had a big brick home. The guy on the left, I don't remember where he worked, but he was sure athletic. And then there were 3 homes beyond his, down to the corner, and going around the corner to your right would be one house and a neighborhood grocery store.
What was the name of the town this house was in?
Ironwood, Michigan.
Okay. You mentioned that before. I wanted to make sure that we were in the same town. Good. Now, what do you remember about the schoolhouse you went to school in? And your teachers?
I went to a Catholic school, and was about a mile and a quarter from home, which we walked it. And there were one building, all wooden, 3 floors, that took up 6th to 12th grades. There was another one just up the street, a smaller building that took the 1st through the 5th. We didn't have a kindergarten. And the big school, it was St. Ambrose School was the name of it. That school was wood, and the heating was negligible. Wintertime we generally wore the clothes we came to school in the classroom. But it took us through high school, and the teachers were excellent.
Any of them stand out in your memory?
Yes, the science teacher, I'm trying to think of her name, but she was the first nun that ever got a pilot's license. And when I was in England, if I may just spread out a little bit, when I was in England, I watched television one evening, and here was the flying nun, Sister Aquinas, that was her name. She had just flown with a jet pilot who said she had taken the controls for about an hour. She was also a captain in the Civil Air Patrol, a flying captain. By the way, we called her Spike. She was as hard as nails and as big as a big spike. I mean, she was tall.
You know, whatever happened to her?
She eventually went to a home for nuns, but I don't know anything more than that.
Is the school still in the same place?
The building is. I don't think they teach, it's a school anymore. But it's been years since I've been up there.
Are you aware if your home is still standing?
Yes, it is. Still, and I don't know how 9 of us ever lived, or 10, ever lived in that house. So small.
What about the Depression? How did that impact your family? What do you remember about those days?
Well, I remember that my father had WPA. He worked for them until things picked up again and he went back to work on the railroad. But it was tough. All of the children, if they were, wherever they went, if they saw a possibility for some work that pay a few pennies or a few dimes, we'd stop and ask if we could work for them. And of course, 50% of the time, yes. I remember throwing 5 cords of wood into the basement. It had been snowing, and there was about 3 inches of snow on top of the plywood, the pile of wood. And I threw it into the basement, went down and piled it up. And this is when I'm on my way home from school. My parents don't know where I am. I piled the wood up. I swept up the basement, put all the chips and stuff in a basket for the woman, knocked on her basement door and asked her to come down and look at it. She came down and looked around and said, "My, you sure did a fine job." And she pulled out a purse, which is about that long, about that wide. It's one of these, more of a pouch. And she reached down in there and came out with a dime. And I suppose I shouldn't say this, but I said, "That's all you're going to pay me, ma'am?" "Well, you did a good job." I said, "Yes." And I went over and took the window out of the basement. I took it and laid it aside and threw 5 cords of wood back out in her yard. "You can't do that." I said, "Just don't stand in the way because you'll get hit by flying wood." And when I got it finished, I went home and got a whipping for being gone so long. It was well past dark. And it turned out this woman she owned about 4 or 5 homes in the neighborhood, so she could have afforded another stipend rather than a dime. But I grew up there in that ironwood and graduated from high school, started to go to junior college there, but I dropped out after a semester because I had to work. They had a big public school, high school, and then another building that had the lower grades in. The town was a pretty poor town, and most of the people in town worked for iron mines. There were about 6 or 7 mines in the area. I left home to go to Ann Arbor, Michigan, in early 40. Went down there and worked for King Sealy Corporation. They made parts for dashes and Ford Motor Company. I worked there until the Willow Run bomber plant, B-24s. When it opened up, I went out and applied for a job out there with the plumbing department because my next door neighbor, who was a plumber, used to take me out on jobs, and I learned quite a bit from him. And I worked there until I was drafted in 42.
What kind of work did you do, what kind of plumbing work did you do at that factory?
It had a tunnel about a mile long underneath it with sump pumps and steam pipes. My job was the sump pumps when I first went there, make sure they were all operating good, and steam traps in the overhead steam lines in the plant. The first thing I got in trouble with the union. There was a union in that shop. I came out of the steam tunnel at noon one day and came into the shop where we worked from, and everybody's sitting around there, and where you been? I said, doing my job. Oh, why? Well, we've been on strike for 2 hours or 3 hours. And I said, for what? Well, the steward just called up and said, we're on strike. And I said, you didn't bother to find out why? And nobody had, and I called the steward on the phone. And I said, what are we striking for? He said, because we called a strike. I said, who called it? Turned out that he called the strike because his office, which normally had a phone in it, they had taken the phone out to put somewhere else in the plant. Phones were in short supply about that time. And I told him, I said, well, when you figure out a good reason, I'll go on strike with you. But until then, no soap. He said, we'll throw you out. I said, I think you better check on the possibilities before you make any threats. And I stayed there anyway and worked until I was drafted.
What do you remember about the day that Pearl Harbor was bombed? Where were you and what were you doing?
I was in a rooming house. And one of the guys came up to the room and he said, hey, come on down. He says, Japs just bombed Pearl Harbor. And I knew what the heck that meant, you know. And so we listened to it, and we all were berating the Japanese and wondering how long it was going to be before we started going into the Army. I asked for a deferment because I was supporting, at that time, my mother and father and 2 brothers and a sister. And I think it was because I was in a strange town working that they turned my bid turned me down anyway on deferment. And I was drafted at Fort Custer, Michigan on the this was in the month of October that I was drafted.
42.
Yeah, I was drafted in 42, that's right, yeah. to Camp Campbell, Kentucky. The 12th Armored Division was just being organized there. I was there until, well, we went through some changes there because we started out with 5 engineer companies, line companies, and we had 2 more armored battalions than we had when we went overseas. But they shuffled them off to some other unit. In fact, I think they got over to Japan or the Philippines, those 2 battalions. I went to Europe. You want me to keep that way?
No, let's go back to Camp Campbell.
Okay.
What do you remember about your training there? Do you remember anything about Hellcat Camp?
We didn't call it Hellcat then, but I didn't anyway. What I remember was that we got up real early in the morning. It was no problem for me to get up in the mornings or to go to bed early, because I'd never had any amusement at home, you know. But the one thing that really sticks in my mind was right above me, the guy that lived in the barracks on the 2nd floor had a radio. And I woke up just about every morning to the song, "I'm walking the floor over you." And I finally told him if he didn't quit playing that in the morning, I'd throw him and the radio out the window. And he quit. I remember also that the first thing in the morning, you had to sweep the whole barracks down, mop it, get cleaned up and shaved if you're going to shave, and you better, and be out, I guess it was 5:30 for reveille. After reveille, we had chow. Anything else?
Who do you remember that was with you in those days? NCOs or officers, commanding officers, anyone?
Well, I remember that the company commander was Captain Moon, M-O-O-N. I can't remember the first sergeant's name or the cook's name, and I wasn't too welcome in the mess hall anyway. I came in one morning to eat, and they had oatmeal, and they just slopped it over everything in the mess kit, mess tray. And I had just got through telling him I didn't want any oatmeal, and he slopped it on top anyway. And I said, "Don't ever do that again." So the next morning, same cook, or KP, did the same thing, and I got company punishment because I reached out and grabbed him by the collar and pulled him and about 15 gallons of oatmeal all over the mess hall floor. Company commander says, "You're going to eat this morning." He said, "Go over and wait for me." And I did. I went over and waited, and he wanted to know what that was all about. And I told him. Well, he says, "You're restricted for 2 weeks." He said, "Even though I kind of feel that you were justified," and then he took care of whatever the problem was in the mess hall. And I might as well, since I'm talking mess halls, I might as well finish up on mess halls. I found many things that I didn't like about a mess hall, and I just kept after them until they do a proper job. If things supposed to be hot, get it hot. If it's supposed to be cold, be sure it's cold. And I think our last mess sergeant was a Sergeant Cicchetti. I'm not sure. It's a long time ago. I didn't like iced tea, but they used to put tea in the Lister bags when we were out in the field. And I complained until they came out and put ice water in one for us that didn't like tea. Captain Moon seemed to be a reasonable sort, and if you had a good reason for something, he'd listen, and if he thought it was worthwhile, he'd do something about it. Oh, and going back out of mess halls, and before I came into the service, a friend of mine was in what they called the state troops, which was a band that got together to take place of the National Guard when they left. And they had the old National Guard buildings, and they had drilling and rifle drill, and a friend of mine got me in. I didn't join. He just got me to come down, and I learned to assemble and disassemble a Lee Enfield rifle, and I learned all the commands for marching, etc., never thinking that it might be do me some real good. But anyway, down at Camp Campbell, one morning the sergeant says, Sergeant Kill? I think it was Sergeant Kill. He said, "Anybody think they can march this platoon?" And I held up my hand. He put me in march in the platoon, and I was able to get him where I wanted him and bring him back. Had no problem. Some of the guys, one guy in another platoon, I saw him give an order, or heard him give an order, and his troops started going the way he wanted them to go. Oh, and Kerr had told, or the first sergeant had told us, "You stand in one place to give these orders." This guy I'm sure that his men heard his order, but he wasn't allowed to run after him, and he just screamed until he was hoarse, and they finally, at the end of it, gave up on bothering him and marched back to him. But we had some fun.
What about other training activities? What training do you remember with weapons, maneuvers, problems, those kinds of things?
Well, I remember going out on the range and my sergeant telling me that he'd zero my rifle in for me. I said, "You can't zero my rifle in for me." He says, "There's one sight picture. Describe it to me," and I described it to him. And anybody that takes that picture, sights a rifle in that way, can sight anybody's rifle in. I said, "No, sir." So he was going to sight mine in, and the last shell that he fired hit in the upper right-hand corner, just inside the target framework. And he said, "There, it's okay now." And I had to watch him as he was going down the line, and then I'd adjust my sights a little bit, take a shot till I got it into the bullseye, and he was back checking on me when I was hitting the bull, and he said, "See, I told you anybody can sight somebody else's rifle in." Got in a little trouble on the anti-tank range because our crew shot the wheels off of the little dolly that was dragging the target around. There was a gap in the earthen embankment that it was behind, and I noticed how long it took per second, in seconds, for the train to get from here to there. And I told my crew, "I'll give you the word when to shoot, but you just aim for that gap." They did, and I said, "Fire," and they fired and knocked it off the track. I think General Ennis, I don't know, but the general was out there observing, and he told us it was a good shot, but damned unfortunate it had to screw up the works,
Where did you start learning some of the tools of the trade for engineering, like mine clearing and bridge building and all of that?
Some there. Using a bayonet to probe for mines. And laying mines. We had competitions where you go out, one platoon would lay mines here, another one over there, another one there, and where you couldn't see each other, but you were supposed to go out and do the best job you could laying mines and tripwires and so forth, and then you'd swap around and try and pick up all the mines from the other team. I had one guy that Ed Lane. He was killed in a minefield during the war. But I watched him bury a mine and took a few steps around and came back, and I had one heck of a time finding that mine that I watched him lay. He was that good. But he was careless, and that's what cost him his life and the life of a couple other guys, because we were laying a minefield in Germany, and I said, each man take 2 mines, one in each hand, and go out into the field. And Ed Lane, he gets a broomstick and stuck it between the spiders on 2 mines in each hand. And
Trying to carry 4?
yeah. And I heard a mine went off, and he was out in the middle of the field, and a bunch more went off. Killed him, and I think badly wounded a couple more. We used fireworks, and I get back in place.
Perfect. You use fireworks for what?
For to simulate booby traps in homes, in an old barn or something. And I think we did right well. Very seldom did anybody set one off. We had a good platoon. I thought we were better than most. But then that's the way it should be if you have pride in your unit.
Where did you run into Jules Turvey?
I don't remember Jules until we got to Camp Barkley, Texas. And he was in our platoon. One of them tar paper shacks.
Well, before we get to Barkley, let's talk a little bit about the Tennessee maneuvers. How did that work when you all left to go to the maneuver area? Did you spend any time getting ready and moving out? Talk us through that.
Well, we knew we were going, and we got everything ready. We had to be ready at a certain time to go down to the maneuver area. And we went at night with blackout driving. And there was a hold up in the column, and the column went on ahead of this one truck who had stopped, and we didn't know why he was stopped, but finally I went up and I said, "Hey, nobody in front of you, where are you going? What are you doing sitting here?" Well, I didn't see him go. And we had to wrestle our tails a little bit to catch up and, find the company. And it was I don't even remember what exactly we did on maneuvers, but we seemed to be able to get to where we wanted to go in time. Let's see, was that? I think it was on maneuvers that I got a scar here. I cut my leg and cut an artery.
Really? How did that happen?
I hate to tell you. I was sleeping in the tent and there was a root sticking me in the back. And I reached over and got my bayonet and stuck that knife under this root and give it a jerk and went right into my leg. So, my first wound. I was at I was on maneuvers, and I went into Nashville. There was a hospital in Nashville. And I was there for about 3 weeks. They gave me a leave to go home when they were through with me. And 10-day leave. And I went home, came back. They put me over to Tullahoma, Tennessee, 2nd Army Replacement Center. I was there about 3 weeks, waiting to be shipped to. In the meantime, the outfit moved to Abilene, while I was in the hospital. And when I finally made it to Abilene, I had to prove that I hadn't been AWOL for about 2 or 3 weeks, I finally convinced them that, I had my orders from Tullahoma to get there. And then the people in Tullahoma were looking for me because the day that I was shipped out, they used to send a sergeant in to get everybody out, and then you'd go out and listen. If your name was called, then you had to be out in certain formation at 8 o'clock in the morning. Well, my name was called, so I didn't feel I was going to get up at 5:30 in the morning. And the sergeant grabbed my blanket and going to jerk it off of me, and I came up with the blanket, and I hit him, struck him, and there were bunks, double bunks down the middle of the aisle, and he went flying back and slammed his head against the frame of a bunk and knocked him cold. And I thought, oh, geez, I'm in trouble now. I gathered up all my stuff, my duffel bag and everything, and I went 2 or 3 barracks up where I knew a guy up there and asked him to take care of my stuff for me. And he said, okay. And then I went on the lam until it was time to be down at that certain building, which was a day room on a slope and had a big porch at one end. And I went down there and I knew that sergeant would be looking around for me. And from a distance I could see him looking out over all the faces, you know. And so I went around, I came right toward the front of the building. And as I say, it sloped down quite a bit. And I stayed right close to the side of the building and got under that veranda they were calling the names from. And I peeked out and I see that sergeant standing up there looking all... He didn't figure I'd be this close. And they called my name and I just held my hand up and got my tickets, and they said be ready in so many, such a time, and I was ready. In the meantime, they were looking all over for this sergeant that, I was a sergeant by that time, that struck this sergeant. And when we were down at the station, the lieutenant that took us down there said, boy, I'd sure like to find that guy that slugged my sergeant. He said, do you know anybody that can give me any information? I said, I'll see what I can do. I said, when this train starts to move, I'll tell you. And when the train started to pull out, I let it get going pretty fair, and I hollered out at him, me, my name's Kerr. Nothing ever came of it anyway. And then when I got to Camp Barkley, of course the company thought I had been AWOL because the hospital sent them my discharge date and did tell them that I got a furlough in the meantime. But the orders from Tullahoma showed when I reported into them, and that went along with the figures I said of 10 days leave and then Tullahoma. And it took 2 days. I think it took 48 hours to get from Tullahoma, Tennessee to Barkley, Texas.
Where'd you come in at? Downtown?
I can't remember.
What about vehicles? Now, the Armored Engineer Battalion, the platoon that you were in, what kind of vehicles did you have?
Had a Jeep, a half-track, and 3 trucks, 3 deuce and a halves, and one more that was a platoon tool truck. That was for a platoon, everything.
So it had all the tools and supplies in that?
All the tools we carried in 1 deuce and a half. Now, we weren't out that long to load up with food and stuff, you know.
What about those big Brockway trucks? Did the platoon have one of those, or was that a battalion vehicle? A huge, big 5-ton?
We ourselves, I know what you're talking about, had a hoist for picking up treadway and potting rolled up. That was, they were assigned to us whenever we went on a job. They gave us so many trucks with pontons and so many with treadway.
What about the bridges that you built during training? Did you ever build any Bailey bridges during training?
Yes. Sections, not from one shore to another or anything like that. And with the float bridge at Barkley, they took us out and gave us some practice putting up float bridge on a little small lake someplace. And it was hot. Man, it was hot. And we had to, they made us wade out in the water with the pushing the sections as we got them ready. And when we had done the prescribed number of pontons and treadway and anchored it properly, then they had us take it down. And again, wading in the water. We got it down, repackaged, and back on the trucks. And like I said, it was hot. And we wanted to go swimming. Oh, you can't go swimming in that lake. There's too many moccasins in there. Okay to work on the bridge, but not just swim.